Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for our final Monday enrichment program of the 2021 season. We're so happy to have all of you who have joined us on this Zoom journey this year, and we hope you've enjoyed all of the diverse programming that we have contributed this year. This is our final literature program, and I want to thank our literature sponsors who have sponsored us for this whole year, and they are Convoys, Westchester Funeral Home, and Forest Park Bank. Thank you to both of you for helping us support us and put on these amazing programs. Well, before we get started, I just want to let you know that if something sparks a curiosity, either a question or a comment, you can type that into the Q&A or the chat. And if there's time at the end of the program, we will unmute you and you can ask your question or say your comment. Without further ado, we are going to bring on Deb Hammond. Deb is our literature chair, but she is also a brand new program director for the 21-22 program season. Deb, take it away.
Hi, I'm only a co-director because I'm sharing that position with Bill Young. So you'll be seeing more of us as we go forward. And also I want to remind everyone that most of our programs, our Zoom programs, are available on our website after a suitable delay for editing. So if you want to see anything again, or if you missed any programs, there is that opportunity to do it even during the summer. And our plan right now is we will be back in the building come fall. We're all looking forward to being able to gather together, to have our luncheons, and to be able to hear these programs together. I'm very, very pleased to bring today Charles Cosgrove, who is a professor of early Christian literature and the director of the PhD program at Garrett-Evangelical Seminary. The seminary is a part of, or is located on Northwestern, and it is the final incarnation of the institution founded by Eliza Garrett, one of the main characters in this dual biography. So it was founded in 1853 and is still in existence. Charlie Cosgrove has a variety of books on all different topics, going way back to the beginning of Christianity and coming forward to Chicago history in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s with this book. He is a lifelong native of Chicago, a history buff, and a professional jazz player. I found this book really, really interesting because it covers the early history of Chicago at a very early time that I didn't know a lot about. Back when Chicago was 8,000 people. The Garretts started on the East Coast and went to the West. The West, where they ended up, was Chicago. So learning about Chicago in this time period when it was still just a swamp that had some buildings thrown up here and there. And if you were lucky, there might be some plank sidewalks that you could try and get out of the mud on. And it was just very, very interesting. Learning about a church that was put onto a scow and floated across the Chicago River to be on the other side for easier access for the individuals. So it just was very, very fascinating. And then learning about some of the early Presbyterian and Methodist history, both out on the East Coast where the Garretts started, and then here in Chicago while they were establishing themselves here. So it was great hearing about the Great Awakening, the Presbyterian and Methodist early churches of the time, and the early history of Chicago. So I'm very pleased to present Charles Cosgrove.
Thank you very much, Deb. As I hope that my picture is showing. You don't know too much, hadn't read too much about early Chicago, Deb, because so much was lost during the Chicago fire. And that's made this era, the early 19th century before the fire, such a challenge for investigators. In the countryside of southern New York State, just west of the Hudson River and 5 miles north of the city of Newburgh, lies a hamlet called Middle Hope. There, in the mid-1820s, a farmer named Augustus Garrett, who was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran, married a farmer's daughter named Eliza Clark. Augustus's father gave him a parcel of land, and Augustus tried to make a go of farming. But he was too distracted by other interests, and before long, he and Eliza were on their way to Cincinnati with a newborn daughter named Imogene. Now, Augustus was a friendly, outgoing young man of 30. He had a great sense of humor and thought of himself as an effective and entertaining speaker. So, in Cincinnati, he went into the auctioneering business, and he failed miserably. Burdened with debt, he tried making a new start in another place, taking Eliza, Imogene, and a new baby son named Charles to New Orleans. But things turned out no better there. Or in Natchitoches, where they went next. Natchitoches in 1833 was the final point of their journey west and southwest, and they returned home to the Hudson Valley in 1833. Now, business failures were not the worst of the Garrett's woes. In the fall of 1832, while they were still living in Cincinnati, a cholera pandemic reached that place with terrible effects. And the reason for their departure had been less because of death and mostly because of the rising death toll. The Garretts had gone from Cincinnati down the Ohio River with daughter Imogene and baby Charles to escape the plague in Cincinnati. Imogene fell ill and died along the way. They buried her on the banks of the Ohio River at Paducah, Kentucky. Their son Charles died in Natchitoches, and their third child, John Augustus, was stillborn shortly after they arrived back in Newburgh. All 3 children were eventually memorialized on a Garrett monument in the Newburgh Town Cemetery. The Garretts would never have another child. Augustus may have owed his creditors in Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Natchitoches as well, as much as $50,000, an enormous sum in 1833. But he was determined to pay to the last cent, as he put it. It was a matter of honor with him. So he set off to an outpost on Lake Michigan in what was then called the Northwest. Eliza remained in New York with her parents. Augustus journeyed to Chicago by boat, traveling 1,300 miles, up the Hudson River to Albany, west on the Erie Canal to Buffalo, south on Lake Erie to Detroit, north again into Lake Huron and up to the Canadian border, then west again into Lake Michigan and south to Chicago. At this time, Chicago was a settlement of perhaps 400 souls, some living in and around Fort Dearborn, shown in the slide, others near Wolf Point. Augustus found lodging in the Saguenay Hotel at the Point, and he went back into the auctioneering business. It was a favorable time for money making in Chicago. Construction had begun on a federally funded harbor to make Chicago a viable port. The Illinois and Michigan Canal had just been chartered, which would link the Chicago River with the Illinois River and thus the Mississippi River in New Orleans. And the federal government was releasing thousands of acres of land for sale on the public market. The land had been ceded by the Potawatomi and other tribes after the Black Hawk War of 1832. The Indians had agreed to relocate in exchange for money and land west of the Mississippi. The harbor, the promise of the I&M Canal, and the newly available land brought hordes of newcomers into town, and Augustus himself arrived in Chicago just in time to participate in the land craze. It was a stroke of good luck that he possessed some experience in one of the most lucrative professions of the moment, auctioneering. By October of 1835, when he made an accounting of his sales after just 9 months, Augustus discovered that he had transacted $1,800,000 of business for the year to that point. Assuming that he earned only a 2% commission on those auction sales, he would have netted $36,000 in just 9 months, an extraordinary sum in 1835, amassed in an extraordinarily short time. During this year of success, he sent for Eliza. She traveled the same 1,300 miles from Newburgh by the waterways and arrived in Chicago sometime in the summer of 1835, joining Augustus in the Sauganash Hotel. The last of the Potawatomi left Chicago that August. A judge named John Caton, who was a boarder at the Sauganash in those days, recalls how the handful of wives who lived at the hotel, Eliza would have been one of them, stood at the upstairs parlor windows of the hotel to watch a group of Potawatomi men in ceremonial attire perform an elaborate departing dance, which concluded in the yard of the hotel. There was little debate among Chicagoans about Indian removal. Most white Americans of the Northwest approved the Jacksonian policy toward Native peoples and salved their national conscience by pointing out that the federal government had given the Native tribes a large piece of land in Iowa, along with debt cancellation, goods, and nearly $1 million immediate monetary payment and annuities. Eliza's pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Porter, took a different view and was daring enough to proclaim it from the pulpit, which eventually precipitated the end of his ministry in Chicago. He made a new start in Peoria, where he opposed slavery from the pulpit and got in hot water again. Porter accused the federal government of using the army to frighten Native Americans into making treaties. And he wrote a letter to a friend that the Indians, quote, sell their fatherlands to the grasping whites and retire from a resting place for a resting place beyond the Mississippi. But woe to those who make haste to be rich. Augustus Garrett was one of those making haste to get rich off the newly available Native people's lands. He also started dealing in goods on commission. And in addition to that, he went into business with a man named Nathaniel Brown and Brown's brother. Garrett and the Browns bought land cheaply in rural Illinois and Michigan and began selling lots in paper towns. Now, a paper town was a village that existed only prospectively on the paper that described it in glowing advertisement and in maps that pictured homes, main street stores, town halls, parks, and churches. Garrett was involved with at least 8 such places: Kankakee City, Vienna, Juliet, Enterprise, Peru, Dresden, and Baileytown, all in Illinois, along with Ionia in Michigan. All these towns had been recently platted, but only half of them went on to become populated communities. Kankakee City, Enterprise, Dresden, and Ionia fizzled out, although some of these names ended up as the monikers of other towns that did develop. The fate of Ionia is an example. To establish Ionia, Garrett and Brown formed a partnership with 2 Michigan locals who were supposed to run a general store, a lumber business, and a construction company to build houses in Ionia. The plan went nowhere. Federal land agents in Ionia County decided to establish a town of their own named Ionia. And this second Ionia usurped Garrett and Brownstown which died and was much later replanted as Prairie Creek, another settlement that failed to take root. Meanwhile, a different town of Ionia grew up nearby, and that Itonia thrives to this day. It did not matter to Garrett whether towns flourished or perished, only whether he sold the plots he owned. His bank account and personal holdings in Chicago real estate were growing, so was his reputation. Chicagoans flocked to his auction rooms just to hear his entertaining way of touting goods and telling jokes and anecdotes. He became well known and well liked, and on the strength of his newfound wealth and popularity, he went into politics. First as an alderman, starting out as a Whig in one election, then switching parties and becoming a Democrat for the next. Augustus became a Democrat not because of ideology, but because the Democrats were the largest and the most powerful political party in the city, which gave him an advantage when he ran for mayor in 1843. In those days, mayoral terms were for 1 year. Augustus was elected 3 years in a row in 1843, 1844, and 1845. His achievements as mayor were suited to the times. National financial troubles had caused economic slumps across the country, and Chicago was in considerable debt. At the same time, the growing population was putting a strain on infrastructure. A spate of ordinances was recorded in mid-May to address issues of public health and related nuisances. One law prohibited the dumping of dung, carrion, dead animals, offal, or other putrid or unwholesome substance, including the contents of any privy, onto the lakeshore, waterways, public grounds, or city lots. It also forbade the disposal of rubbish, wood, glass, stone, shells, chips, or any filthy or other substance into gutters of the street or alleyways. It proscribed the grazing or roaming of animals in the public parks. It prohibited the posting of handbills and placards on houses, stores, signs, and fences. And it outlawed the placing of casks, crates, barrels, planks, stoves, or wood on sidewalks. The specifications painted a vivid picture of the habits of citizens that the ordinances enacted under Garrett's first term were meant to curb. As far as spending was concerned, Garrett was determined to economize. His first year in office, he and the council were confronted with only a few extraordinary expenses, among them a fire hydrant and hose and a Clark Street sewer. The ordinary expenses of the city were appreciably less than the year before, only about $4,500. And one of Garrett's most important achievements as mayor was to negotiate a reduction of one of the city's loans from a New York bank, which he did during one of his business trips to New York. Yet it all bored Garrett to death. The council meetings about sidewalks and working privileges, the municipal paperwork and correspondence, the citizens taking up his time with their requests and complaints. He received no salary and could exercise only minimal patronage. City government was not yet a money garnering opportunity for Chicago politicians. In fact, being mayor cost Garrett valuable time away from his businesses, and he was annoyed that he was expected to be a public example of generosity by contributing to benevolences. City work, along with his business activities, left him exhausted and took a toll on his health. Yet he took satisfaction in steering the city in a favorable direction, and he especially liked the honor of the office. Garrett craved public esteem. In a letter to one of his New York cousins, he bragged, "I have gained 10 times the honor that all the rest of the mayors have ever gained who have succeeded me." I think he meant preceded me now that I look at this quotation. Again, they have a jealousy because I have gained the victory over them again. When he said this, he expected his cousin to understand perfectly. Life was a contest of honor for ambitious men of this era. For them, wealth was a means, a precondition for achieving status, including election to public office. Augustus turned out to be a very able mayor, but not a visionary, but a good manager. He wanted the city books to balance and the city streets to be clean and tidy. Although he was boosterish in outlook, he was also in his middle age, essentially risk averse and fiscally conservative, making him well suited to governance at this debt-ridden moment in Chicago's history. As the year 1843 drew to a close, Garrett told his cousin that, quote, the whole city was in favor of his reelection, but he feared that another year in office would be bad for his health. Yet when the Democrats convened to nominate their slate of candidates for the March election of 1844, Garrett was the party's unanimous choice. So he agreed to run again. He could not resist the limelight. The 1844 mayoral election started off well, but ended badly for Garrett, even though he won. Election activities that were usually regarded as acceptable or at least inconsequential became points of contention when the election results showed that only a handful of votes separated the victor Garrett from his Whig opponent, George Dole. Disappointed Whigs circulated accusations about irregularities, including the following. First, that Norwegians were given rides to the polls in wagons provided by Garrett and his friends. Second, that Garrett or one of his friends engaged in treating, specifically providing a keg of beer to voters near one of the polls. Third, that Garrett paid for some number of votes. Fourth, that the clerks at one of the polls opened ballots in the sight of voters in order to intimidate them. Fifth, that certain clerks in the 3rd and 5th wards were ineligible to serve, whether by age or residence. And sixth, that those operating the 5th ward poll opened it too early. Many depositions were taken concerning this last issue, but they revealed more about the idiosyncrasies of timekeeping in Old Chicago than they did about the poll in question. The 5th Ward polling place was Elihu Granger's house. Ballots were handed in to the election clerks and judges through a side window that looked out onto Granger's yard. The Whigs claimed that this poll had been opened early, that is, before 8 a.m., and that the clocks at Granger's house had been moved forward to disguise that fact. Much of the questioning of witnesses concerned when a man named Henry Joyce had voted. Joyce had crossed the river that morning to get his breakfast meat from a butcher. There was a dispute about whether he voted on his way back or after he ate. And if it was before, then at what time? This led to investigation of when the butcher went to breakfast at a restaurant where the breakfast hour was rung in by a grandfather clock that stopped whenever someone on the settee next to it bumped one of its weights, a frequent occurrence, and how accurately the parlor clock of Henry Clark kept time, since he was one of the clerks who opened the 5th Ward poll. In the end, most of the charges against Garrett and the Democrats were diffused. Under oath, the leading supporters of Dole admitted that providing transportation to the poll and treating were common, and that they themselves had engaged in those same election activities. Only one case of someone allegedly being paid for his vote was produced, and the charge was not proved, nor was it proved that the 5th Ward poll was opened early. And the Dole supporters admitted in their depositions that they knew of no fraud or other illegal activity by Garrett. The investigation did find that 2 clerks, one in the 3rd Ward and one in the 5th, were not eligible to vote in Chicago, which made them ineligible to serve as election clerks. The city council referred this matter to the Judiciary Committee, composed of 2 Whigs and 1 Democrat. This committee decided that the results in these 2 wards were problematic because of the technically unqualified clerks. Nothing ever came of all the investigations into timepieces in Chicago, many of which I have shared with you because they're too numerous to cite. Garrett cared only about his reputation, and he quickly devised a plan to recoup his honor. He carried out this plan at the next meeting of the city council, when the committee of the judiciary was to bring its report. Afterward, he wrote to a friend named Maloney, giving him a blow-by-blow description of the meeting. It took place in the saloon building, with Garrett, already sworn in for his second term as mayor, presiding. The room was so crowded, Garrett told Maloney, they were on top of each other to see what was to take place. 40 pages of depositions were read aloud, and Garrett thought this reading had a tendency to raise him in the estimation of every person in the room. Garrett then stood and made a magnanimous gesture calculated to impress, and its grandeur caused him a flush of elation. He later told Maloney how at that moment he felt, quote, as good as if I were in heaven. To the astonishment of everyone, now that he had been vindicated of wrongdoing by the reading of the deposition, he promptly tendered his resignation. The council was in perfect confusion, he said, caught completely by surprise and unsure what to do next. When the whole room was in an uproar, one of the aldermen moved adjournment, and the rest agreed. Eventually, a new election was called, and Garrett's friends urged him to run again. He refused, and a likable fellow named Sherman went on to win. Garrett felt relieved and vowed never to enter politics again. It was too much work and hard on his health. But a year later, he was a candidate for mayor again, and he won. One of his most important efforts during his second term in office was to get city council to take public health more seriously. He made sure that the council heeded the reports of the Board of Health, and he saw to it that the city's health ordinances were enforced. He also urged the construction of a new hospital, a so-called pest house, which was immediately erected. The word pest was short for pestilence, and the hospital was called a pest house because persons with communicable diseases, such as smallpox, were quarantined there. In fact, it was a recent report of cases of smallpox that prompted Garrett to make city health his first priority. Just weeks into office, he issued a proclamation encouraging vaccination, a timely topic, isn't it? Note the provision in the announcement for vaccinating the poor. It's there at the end. Cemeteries situated near the lake also posed health risks. Although most of the public concern about them had to do with respect for the dead, not sanitation problems resulting from corpses being buried in city land with a high water table. Public meetings about cemetery conditions had been held in 1842 after heavy rains brought ruptured coffins to the surface. The newspapers expressed the public's outrage against the spectacle of bones bleaching on the lakeshore. During his first term as mayor, Garrett and the city council had seen to it that a fence was erected, and Garrett had meant to do more, mentioning in his second inaugural the depredations by the disinterment of bodies, and in the grossest violation of private feeling as well as public decency. He was referring to grave robbing. In his second term, when erosion was damaging a different, older cemetery, Garrett insisted on an ordinance requiring the city sexton to notify the mayor whenever shifting sand or some other cause exposed any coffins in the old burying ground. Then there were moments of levity. Among various matters in connection with animals living and dead, The council was asked to deal with a problem of wild geese on the city walkways and thoroughfares. A group of petitioners demanded action. To the Honorable Mayor, they wrote, the members of the Common Council of the City of Chicago, Illinois, as you have begun the good work of removing nuisances, we would call your attention to what your petitioners consider one of the greatest. We find of late a number of flocks of geese parading the streets and using especially the sidewalks for a common highway. And as the old proverb holds true, they eat all before them and poison all behind them. And I don't know if you can hear that my clock, which has bird songs, is now chiming. Some birds honk here as I talk about the geese. And moreover, they are the nastiest of all creatures. We would pray your honorable body that they receive from your hands no quarter, but that you dispose of them in a summary manner. And as in duty bound, we with all good citizens will ever pray till said nuisance be removed. Faced with 15 earnest signers, the council responded immediately with a tongue-in-cheek ordinance requiring that the owner of any goose collected by the pound keeper pay a fine of 12 cents for said goose plus pound fees. There were few, if any, owners of geese, of course, and all the flocks of geese trooping through the streets were wild. While Augustus was busy with business and politics, Eliza was active in church organizations. Although she eventually assisted in founding a Methodist seminary on the campus of Northwestern University, which was also founded by Methodists, for most of her life, she was a Presbyterian and not a Methodist. And although she was a faithful church attender and active participant in church benevolences her whole life, she did not become an official member of any church until she was in her late 30s. The reasons for that had to do with a combination of factors, including Presbyterian polity and theology in that era, as well as Eliza's own spiritual journey. I'm not going to tell that story here, except to say that she struggled to feel within herself the dramatic emotions that Presbyterians after the Second Great Awakening said were the marks of election and conversion. She was probably afraid to be examined by Presbyterian elders about whether she had these inner marks. Yet such an examination was required for membership in a Presbyterian church. Her grief and bitterness over the loss of her children probably contributed to a spiritual state that made it hard for her to be swept up in the usual revivalist emotions of the time. Unlike the Presbyterians, the Methodists accepted seekers as full church members. One could join a Methodist church without having the inner religious experiences that were thought to be the proofs of salvation. And with or without these inner experiences, Eliza joined the Methodist Church in Chicago after a series of revival meetings in 1839. By the way, that church survives to this day. Its current building is the Chicago Temple at Clark and Washington. Augustus joined this church too, then fell away. That is, he had to leave because he did not wish to keep the temperance pledge. But he had tended to be averse to organized religion anyway. Although he made some gifts to the Methodists, he eventually soured on the church. He also determined that he would not leave any of his wealth to a so-called good cause, but in addition to providing for Eliza while she lived, would settle his whole estate on his own relatives. So it came about that when Augustus died suddenly in 1849 at the age of 48, Eliza's inheritance was strictly limited. The great bulk of Garrett's wealth was in real estate, and his will granted Eliza only a life estate. That is, she could live off rents from the real estate, but she could not sell any part of it. And when she died, it would all go to Augustus's relatives, since he and Eliza had no living children. There was a way around this, however. The Garrett's lawyer, Grant Goodrich, explained to Eliza that she could renounce her share in the will and take a share of the estate through another means, so-called dower. This would entitle her to half. The rest would then go to Garrett's kin. So that is what she did. Now, although Augustus had no interest in using his estate for charitable purposes, Eliza felt differently, and she began to ponder the possibilities. Several years later, in 1853, she decided to make out a will and bequeath all her real estate to found a school of higher education. The idea was that she would support the school with rents from these properties, and that upon her death, her real estate would be passed on to the school. You will be interested to learn that most of her real estate was located in the southeast corner of Wolf Point, where the north and south branches of the Chicago River meet the main stem. You can see that on the slide. This is extremely valuable real estate today, and it was comparably valuable then too. Eliza turned to lawyer Goodrich to draft the will, and she also asked him to consult esteemed Methodists whom he knew to get advice about worthy causes to which she might devote her estate. Based on what can be established about this process of inquiry and Eliza's own views, she was thinking about an institution of higher education, and she seems to have settled on the idea of founding a women's college. But the men consulted by Goodrich had a different view. They thought a theological school for the training of ministers was a more pressing need. One especially influential voice was Daniel Kidder, the corresponding secretary of the Methodist Sunday School Union. In the fall of 1853, Goodrich arranged for Eliza to meet with her own pastor, Reverend John Clark, and with Kidder, who had come to Chicago from New York for a Methodist conference. At this meeting, in Goodrich's office, Kidder argued for a theological school. And when he was back in New York, he wrote a revealing letter to Goodrich. The need for a ministerial school is very great, he wrote, while the need to establish a female college is not. Kidder's letter shows that all the Methodist men wanted a theological school. The female college was Eliza's idea, and the men were trying to talk her out of it. Before finishing the story of Eliza and her will, I want to point out some things about the condition of women in this period. Of course, they did not have the right to vote. They could own property, but they did not share title to their husband's property if they were married. The professions were not really open to them, although a handful of women managed to surmount the social and institutional barriers and make a career in a so-called men's vocation. Looking through all the names in the Chicago City Directory for 1844, I found only 19 women who were earning some kind of a living. 7 milliners, 4 dressmakers or tailors, 2 laundresses, 3 teachers, 3 boarding house operators. There may have been more women in the workforce, but these examples give an idea of the restricted scope of their opportunities. Almost all businesses, small and large, were owned and operated by men. Almost all property belonged to men, and almost every organization was run by men or had all male boards, including most women's organizations. For example, Dorcas societies, which were Christian women's charitable organizations, typically had all male governing boards. And you will see from the slide that even the Young Women's Seminary in Chicago, which was a finishing school, had a male principal and all male board. To return to the story of the Garretts and bring it to a conclusion. Eliza wanted to do something to improve women's opportunities in the Northwest by establishing a women's college, but she felt the weight of the Methodist men's insistence that there was a more pressing need for a theological school. In the end, she bowed to the men, helped along by a suggestion by Goodrich, a kind of compromise that is easy to interpret cynically in retrospect. Just weeks after meeting with Goodrich and Kidder, Eliza made out a will assigning a third of her estate to friends and relatives and 2/3 to the Garrett Biblical Institute, which was founded in those same weeks on the strength of her decision. She also directed that should the Institute not need all the monies bequeathed to it, the excess should be used to establish a female college to be erected in Chicago or its vicinity. Not surprisingly, there never was any surplus, and the female college never materialized. But there is an interesting coda to the story. Northwestern University was founded at the same time as the Biblical Institute and by essentially the same group of Methodists. The university did not admit women, but within just a few years, Methodist women in Evanston were lobbying the trustees to give women their own college or permit them to matriculate into the men's colleges. And in 1869, the university began admitting women after electing a new president named Erastus Haven. Haven came from the University of Michigan, where as president, he had been unsuccessful in persuading his board of trustees to open the university to women. According to Francis Willard, a famous Evanstonian of those years, Haven made admission of women to Northwestern a condition of his acceptance of the presidency. Unfortunately, Eliza did not live to see this development. She died in 1855, shortly after Garrett Biblical Institute opened its doors to students. But the institute she founded did serve her interest in providing higher education to women. In the 1870s, just 2 decades after it opened, Garrett Biblical Institute began admitting women and granting them theological degrees, which was remarkable for the times. In 1879, a Garrett student named Mary Phillips became only the second woman in North America to receive a theological degree. And although Eliza Garrett herself never achieved more than a grammar school education, she was the first woman in North America to found an institution of higher education. That school, now called Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, has educated some 10,000 men and women since opening its doors in 1855, and it still sits on the campus of Northwestern University. Thank you for your attention. That completes the slideshow.
Great. Well, that was so interesting. Oh my gosh. Deb actually has requested that she ask the first question. Deb.
Hi. It was really fun reading about all these different people in the book, and the people that we may not know too much about, but we see their names all the time, like Ogden and Newberry.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me wonder, Newberry Library, to put you on the spot, Charles, Newberry Library made an apology recently, and I assume it comes from actions taken in this time period or slightly later. Can you tell us anything about that?
I don't know specifically what they apologized for. I do know that there were dealings by some New Yorkers named Bronson that Newberry was involved with that were dubious, morally dubious, maybe illegal. And it's possible that they referred to that. But a larger issue would have been the recognition now that's broadly made by institutions of higher learning, including libraries like Newberry in this area, that all their wealth, the land and the wealth that flowed from it, came from Indian removal. And Northwestern University several years ago conducted an extensive study of their founder, patron Evans, John Evans, who was a Methodist who acquired the land and was an Indian hunter, gained his reputation that way. And so Northwestern made apology, but also did a very detailed historical study and had an exhibit in the library as a way to bring awareness to its history. So a number of institutions are doing that, and it could be that the Newberry Library had some, felt that it ought to say something about its patron.
Yeah, it was related to land, I know.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. What in terms of
whether it was exclusion of blacks from certain areas or what, I don't know, but it sounded like it could easily have come from some of the things that were going on in this time period.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Deb. All right, I'm going to say goodbye to you, Deb. We'll see you later. Let's see what else we have. So we have a question from Gary. I'm going to unmute you, ask you to unmute actually. And if you want to ask your question, hi.
Hello, can you hear me, see me?
I can't see you, but I can definitely hear you, which is exactly what I was hoping for.
Okay. The question is, I'm sort of a local historian and I'm involved with the local historical society. And when the land was originally sold by the federal government in 1835, Augustus Garrett was one of the purchasers of something like 7 different parcels. And I've never seen his name on a subdivision map or anything like that. I didn't realize that he was in the sort of bulk auction business. So did he basically just buy that and sell that in 1835 or 36? Or did he ever subdivide it or build anything here or anything like that?
So you're talking about land in Oak Park, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, from what I was able to establish, he bought parcels of land in many places in Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan. And then these got turned over. He tried to develop some, but he quickly turned the land over. And that's why he isn't recognized as the founder of any of these places. By the way, Gurnee was a close friend of the Garretts, and there's a town in Illinois named after Walter Gurnee, but he never lived there. He really had no association with it. And I'm not clear exactly how it got his name. So these, in any case, Garrett, he bought land in the name of his, in the name of Eliza as well, and he bought land for some of his relatives. And this was just, as you put it, Gary, turned over. Land would be sold. People would buy it just to sell it because the price was going up so quickly.
Are records of his business, do they exist anywhere? Could anybody look up who he sold that to or something like that?
Land sales are not in the only records of his business. Everything was destroyed in the Chicago fire or thrown out by relatives. Northwestern University has some of his letter books. There were no carbon paper in those days, but they would wet an undersheet of paper so that then when they wrote a letter, the ink would flow through and would make really a beautiful copy. And then those copies were saved for records. And so about 2 to 3 years or more of Garrett's letters, business letters, were preserved and then bound together in books and are in the library at Northwestern in their archives. And that was an invaluable source of information to me because he included some family, some personal letters were in there along with business letters. But the other kinds of documents and deeds and so forth, these are in random places and the vast majority were destroyed. Although I did find a database, I'm not remembering exactly what it was, but I think it was either through Cook County or through the state of Illinois where land sales were listed. It was online and it showed Garrett's name on a number of these sales. Just in a list, not in a deed.
I just have one additional comment. You mentioned his having something to do with the Bronsons and there being some controversy. I have on my wall a deed from when Arthur Bronson bought a piece of the school section in 1833.
Oh,
And as
really?
you probably know, Frederick and Arthur Bronson were the New York Life Insurance Company. So together they bought 1.8 million acres of land in the West. And it was Charles Butler bringing Arthur Bronson to Chicago that started the land boom. So there is a story there.
Right. Yes, I was aware of that detail. That's very interesting. Ogden had dealings with the Bronsons, and Augustus Garrett, in one of his private letters to his New York cousin, says that Ogden is his personal enemy. He's trying to destroy him. Ogden and the Bronsons are out to get him. They're all a bunch of dishonest crooks.
So he must have felt the same way about Charles Butler.
Yeah. I don't recall that he mentions him, but he probably did.
Okay.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much.
Yeah, those are wonderful comments. I'm really happy to hear those.
So I have a question while we wait for some more questions to come in. As a biographer or a historian, you kind of have to try to stay objective with the person you're writing about. Just as Charlie though, like, from your research, what did you think about him, like his character?
Yeah, well, he comes off quite mixed, and I think that he viewed himself as a highly moral, honorable person. There's no question, because in his personal letters, he talks about himself in that way. And if there's ever a hint of criticism of him on matters of morals or honor, he is on the attack. But he had ways to rationalize things that he did so that he could maintain that sense of honor. And I think he paid off some people who made those depositions at the time of his election, not because he wanted to win, and maybe not because he even thought he had done anything wrong, but because he wanted to make sure they looked really, really good when they were read aloud at the meeting. So that was that's the nature of Garrett. He sold a slave as a young man when he was about 30. One of his sister died, and his sister's son became his ward. Okay. And the ward had inherited a slave. This was in Baltimore. And Augustus had to decide what to do with the slave. If he brought the slave into New York, the slave would have become free. He would first become like an indentured service, and he would become free after a certain number of years when he reached a certain age. New York had really complicated laws about this because the sentiment was so mixed. And Garrett decided to simply have the slave sold in Baltimore. And so he had no conscience about that, even though he grew up in an era where there was lots of debate about slavery. When he became a Methodist, or when he converted and he joined the Methodist Church, he had to confess all of his sins, including slavery. It was explicit. The Methodists included that in their statement of what you need to renounce. Any dealing with slavery, they were explicit. So I think he probably confessed that sin. And later on, he does make statements in his inaugural addresses condemning slavery. So I think he had a change of heart. But when it came to money, I don't know that he was really that progressive on any matters of civil rights. So
do you think, and I have a question, there's another question coming, but do you think like some of the choices that she made were almost as like I'm getting you back, or like like she was like, well, here's what I'm going to do, so she was trying to circumvent him a little bit.
From her, a few letters of hers that are preserved, that she was really devoted to him. When he died, she felt lost, absolutely lost. But she had a mind of her own, and she talked herself into the belief that even though he said he didn't want to give his money to charitable causes, deep in his heart, he knew he should have. And so she was going to make good on that, the
Well,
better
they
angels.
both have a way of rationalizing stuff in their brains to kind of get what they wanted.
Yeah, and I think in the end, even though she was kind of talked into founding a theological school, she was a devoted Methodist, and I think she was very, very proud of what she saw of the school and was all in once she had made the decision.
Oh, well, that's nice. And you just wonder if their children hadn't all passed away, who knows what each one of their futures would have
Right.
continued with.
Yeah.
All right, Judy Eckberg has a question for you. Judy, do you want to unmute?
Hello, I'm looking at the painting behind you. Is
Oh.
that white?
Let's see. No, that's Mary Cassatt.
Oh, it is. Oh, it's a
Yeah, it's a little girl sitting on the beach. I think all you can see is the sand and her feet.
There was,
There
a local artist who did things similar to that.
Oh, okay. No, we just got prints that we framed.
Thank you.
She's watching as much as she's listening. Debbie doesn't have a question. She says, our Here family is from Galena, and I read that when Chicago sought loans to expand, Galena bankers refused, thinking Chicago was not going to amount to much. Which if it was a swampland and, it just sounded horrible at the time.
Yes, and this era of the latter part of the 1830s was in financial turmoil. Although Chicago was growing and money was being made hand over foot by some, there was a financial crisis in 1837 under the Jacksonian administration. I won't go into why, but
okay.
It caused a crash. And at this time, banks issued their own currency. So it was quite complicated. And currency all started rushing to New York, and all kinds of banks were left without currency, and it created tremendous instability. And so Galena, the bank in Galena, was probably issuing its own currency, and whenever this happened, whether it was in the 1830s or 40s, it was probably being very cautious in light of experience.
Oh yeah, I can see that. All right, we're getting close to the end of time, but I have some questions, so I'm just going to ask them on behalf of the people. Edie Schaefer wants to know what prompted your interest in this subject.
Okay. Well, I started teaching at Garrett Seminary in 2011. I had taught at another school for 27 years. When I got to Garrett, I wanted to know a little bit about its history. Probably somebody gave me some small bit. And so I read it, and then I found something else. And then before I knew, I was kind of studying the history of Garrett, is one I was able to do. Not that there was very much information, but I had a subscription to Ancestry.com. So I tried to see if I could find anybody, in ancestry. And then I had done some work in the Chicago History Museum on another Chicago-related subject. Next thing I knew, I was in the Chicago History Museum Library Center looking at the old city books, right? The directories. And there was Augustus Garrett. So before I knew it, I was writing a book.
Oh, wow. That's really, what a tribute though to your school. That
I'll mention that the Illinois State Historical Society recently gave the book one of its outstanding achievement awards in its Best of Illinois awards this year. So I'm very proud of that. It's nice to be part of the Illinois historians.
Congratulations, it's wonderful. All right, the very last question is from our friend Gary again. He wants to know if John Evans played any part in the founding of the seminary.
No, he didn't. As far as I can tell, he did not. No, I'm sure informally, in the sense that they were all friends. Grant Goodrich was a founder, and there were others. They all knew one another, but I have no information about Evans being directly instrumental, writing up the charter or anything like that. it was a man named John Dempster who came from the Methodist Seminary in New York, who helped organize the school academically. And he had founded that seminary, which is as part of Boston University. That's what it became, part of Boston University, which was founded by Methodists about the same time. And that provided the model of the seminary's charter.
And is that the Dempster, that the Dempster was named after? Dempster Street?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And the School of Theology at Boston University was the first school to grant a theological degree to a woman. Garrett was the second. Mary Phillips was the second, but the first one was at the Methodist school there at Boston University. And that woman, I'll end on this note, that woman had gone to Oberlin and tried to get a theological degree there. And they let her take classes, but they wouldn't let her enter a degree program. And she wrote to her friends and said, I might as well just be taking Greek on my own, because it will lead nowhere. And so she left Oberlin, of all places, because we think of Oberlin as the most progressive, right?
Right.
It has a wonderful history of progressivism in civil rights, and went to the Methodist school in Massachusetts and was given.
Good for her. Good for her, her perseverance and knowing what she wanted.
The Methodist bishops promptly ruled that they would not grant license ordination to women. Once these women were given degrees in their local churches, gave them licensure, which local churches could do, the bishops refused to give them ordination. And so that was the end of that.
Oh boy. Okay, so I'm gonna say one more thing, and that Deb put this in chat, but just in case you're not a chat person, your book is available, of course, on Amazon, and it can be ordered from Booktable in Oak Park. I went online and we looked at it before the program, and it was like 2 to 7 business days. So of course, we always recommend you support local. And also through Southern University Press, and that website is www.siupress.com. So there's 3 different ways to get this book. And, like what Deb said was, it's not just the history of these specific people. It's not just the history of the seminary. It's a history of Chicago too. And also, where, of course, women's places were at that time, and all sorts of different things. So it fulfills a lot of different interests. Is there anything else, Charlie, that you would like to add before we wrap today's program up?
No, only that I'm so pleased to have participated in one of the 19th Century Charitable Association's events. And I learned that because you became a mixed gender organization at some time in your past. Now you have your first male president. And so it made me think of the fact that women founded organizations because they didn't have a place in society granted to them. So they had to make their own. But usually it was men who were in charge. So by the end of the 19th century, you were in charge of your own organization, which is
well, absolutely. And if you're not familiar with us, those of you at home, we do recommend you go to our website and look at our history, because we didn't just form this organization. We helped form so many different service organizations in this community and continue to do just amazing things. And I guess you can't keep a good sister down, because we are going to figure out a way, which is really, I think, a good thing to remember when we're feeling low and blue sometimes. Thank you so much. You are our last Monday enrichment program for the season. And like Deb said, we will be back in the fall. But don't be surprised if just maybe you get an email about a program here or there, including this Sunday. We have a wonderful collaboration with Writing Matters, and Elizabeth Berg is going to be speaking with Eileen Beckerman, and that is this Sunday, the 16th at 2 p.m. You gotta get on this program. It's gonna be hilarious. She's they're both amazing authors and amazing women, and it's gonna be awesome. So I will be there. And if you want to continue to support us with some amazing programs in the future, you can donate right on our website at www.19thcentury.org, right on the donate button. And of course, contact us with any questions. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful May, and till we all meet again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.